Hello students, I shall be talking to you today about a major political institution in medieval India during the time of the Delhi Sultanate. And that institution is the institution of kingship. Kingship, you will see, was initially not a robust institution. It was a fledgling institution, but it was consolidated and strengthened and legitimized by very able sultans who came to the helm of the Sultanate from time to time. Men like ZIAUDDIN BALBAN and ALAUDDIN KHILJI, through their prowess, helped to consolidate the institution of kingship. And in this regard, I will also draw your attention to the eloquent historian ZIAUDDIN BARANI, who not only spoke eloquently about the institution of kingship, but also extended very important pieces of advice to the king so that the king could consolidate his realm and the frontiers of the Sultanate could be expanded. Such advice you come across also in Machiavelli's Prince. So ZIAUDDIN BARANI is a name to reckon with in the realm of medieval political thinking in India, and it is with particular reference to his views that we will be grappling with the institution of kingship in medieval times. So let us start. First of all, let me clarify what we generally mean by the institution of kingship. When we talk of kingship, we generally understand a relatively complex and hierarchical structure of society in which a central figure, a king, and it could well be a queen, who usually undertakes a unifying role for the various groups which constitute a society. If this function involves a direct exercise of political power on the part of the person discharging it, in that case, the king may be considered a monarch, and in such a case, kingship becomes identified as a monarchy, a word that technically may mean only a particular form of government. But the two terms do not necessarily have the same connotation, for there could be several cases where the king reigns but does not govern, as in case of the British monarch. It is also possible to govern in an absolute sense as a monarch by holding military office or administering justice without being legitimately entitled to do so. In such cases, the one who so governs does so relying almost entirely on force. This makes the role of engendering social cohesion rather difficult, which is, in fact, ironically the first duty of a king or a monarch. Let us now look at who ZIAUDDIN BARANI was. He was a political thinker par excellence. He lived during the years 1283 to 1359, and he wrote extensively on statecraft and kingship in medieval India, particularly during the reigns of Alauddin Khilji, Muhammad bin Tughlaq, and Firoz Shah Tughlaq. He has been regarded as one of the forerunners among historians and political theorists of his times. His writings provide invaluable insight into the political and administrative life that prevailed during the early years of the Delhi Sultanate and then lasted for almost 100 years. His contribution lies not only in depicting the history of this period, but also in highlighting at length the nature of kingship, its rationale, its duties, and its obligations. He represented the idea of political expediency in the Islamic history. His Fatwa-e-Jahandari, written as a nasihat or advices for the Muslim kings, is a time-tested work on statecraft and easily comparable to such masterpieces as Kautilya's Arthashastra and Machiavelli's Prince. Now let us see how kingship in medieval India gradually evolved. In theory, the Muslim state was a theocracy. That is, the head of the state was also the religious head, and he was looked upon as the representative of God on earth, and therefore derived his position and authority directly from God. Thus, the caliph was the supreme head of the whole Muslim world. Although the sultans of Delhi professed formal allegiance to the caliphate, the sultanate was always an independent state for all practical purposes. Moreover, and please attend to this carefully, the political need and ignorance of the sultans about the Shariat had resulted in a division of the functions of the head of the state. The religious side was looked after by the ulema, and the administrative side was managed, supervised, and organized by the sultan. So what you see is that the sultan was, for all practical purposes, the administrative head of the sultanate. And what was the basis of this sultan's power? The basis was coercion or force. We do not find in the sultans of Delhi a well-entrenched, strong, and robust concept of kingship to rule over the masses. However, they did have a monopoly of force, and with the help of military power, they managed to establish their authority. So this power of the king was basically based on the military and not really on his ability to inflict punishments on wrongdoers. And this is a point which Barani also draws attention to recurrently. This kingship had no moral, religious, or political basis. As a result, the administration under their authority often suffered from various ills. In fact, one encounters various cases of mismanagement, episodes of lack of discipline and disorder throughout the state. The masses were often seen to be not particularly loyal to their sultans and did not respect their status, and there are cases of numerous intrigues being hatched against them. But of course, these people could not rebel openly, as they feared different kinds of sanctions and harsh punishments which the sultan could impose by virtue of his monopolization of coercive power. So how did the sultan consolidate his position in the sultanate? We find a clear example in the case of BALBAN. The theory of kingship propounded by BALBAN led to the adoption of his famous policy of blood and iron. Barani observes in this context that kings who maintained glory and grandeur of court by impressing royal people were able to create fear among their subjects, which actually elevated the position and the prestige of the king. Kings thus created fear through their display of strength and glory among commoners as well as among the nobles. BALBAN was convinced that the only way to effectively deal with the internal and external threats was to augment the power and the prestige of the sultan. Sword was the chief weapon of BALBAN for attaining his objectives. Force or coercion became the mainstay of BALBAN's position and strength, and he used this unhesitatingly and uncompromisingly against whoever dared to defy the authority of the sultan. And this is how BALBAN consolidated the institution of kingship, as I said, through his policy of blood and iron, by virtue of which he was able to remain at the helm of affairs for nearly 40 years. The first 20 years as the Naib or the Prime Minister to Nasiruddin Mahmud, and thereafter as the Sultan of Delhi. He executed his policy of blood and iron successfully, and raise the prestige and power of the Sultan in the eyes of the nobles and his subjects, thereby underlining the position of the Sultan with an element of stability and legitimacy that had hitherto been conspicuous by their absence. The major principle that animated Balban's theory of kingship included the theory of divine right of kings. Balban opined that the king was the representative of God on earth. He declared this to make the nobles believe that he got his crown not from their mercy, but by the mercy of God. Sword was the chief weapon of Balban to achieve his objectives. In affirming this policy, he also made it clear to people in general and to his detractors in particular that any act of defiance against the Sultan will meet with the most stern and severe actions. So how does Barani view kingship as it is evolving in the context of the Delhi Sultanate? With regard to reinforcing the legitimacy of kingship, Barani writes extensively in his masterpiece, Fatwa-e-Jahandari. Barani offered a very clear distinction between the personal life of the Sultan and his role as a political functionary. In both aspects, he contemplates in his being an ideal person. The king is expected to be noble-born, preferably belonging to the family of the monarch, possessing a keen sense of justice, together with the political acumen for sensing deception and conspiracies of the wicked, utilizing his time prudently and profitably, and dividing it judicially between his manifold personal needs and political requirements. He must also be loyal to the Shariat and follow conscientiously the path of the Shariat, which stipulated his role as an agent of God on earth, committed more than anything else to the welfare of the people. That was his express responsibility. As far as following the Shariat was concerned, Barani conceded that in the personal realm, the Sultan may of course slacken now and then. It would be normal to expect him to do so. But Barani definitely opposed the idea of any dilution of standards or responsibilities in the political sphere, as it might jeopardize administration and tarnish the image of the king in the eyes of the people. So what did Barani advise the king? He asked him to achieve the objectives of Islam and cultivate the attributes of terror, prestige, pride, high status, domination, and superiority. He must have a keen sense of timing and the presence of mind to act and react at the opportune moment. He points out that every merit and demerit of the king will be adopted by the subjects. The elect among the subjects will try to cultivate every virtue the king possesses, whether he orders them to do so or not. And the king's vices have pretty much the same effect. Thus, if the king is given to religious devotions, all distinguished men of the country will strive for devotion and piety. Since the good acts of the rulers influence the subjects, no less than their words, the wise king must remember at all times that his good acts warn the governed from things unlawful more than his words. In short, what Barani is trying to suggest is that the king must practice what he preaches. If the ruler drinks wine, speaks lies, breaks promises, and commits injustices, but forbids drinking, lying, promise-breaking, and injustice to the people, no one will pay heed to his advice. But on the contrary, if he abstains from drinking or lying, or breaking promises or behaving unjustly, his virtuous acts will be emulated by most. And that is why Barani sensitizes us to certain meannesses which are incompatible with kingship. And a prudent and a wise king must desist from 5 mean qualities such as falsehood, changeability, deception, wrathfulness, and injustice. And it is important to steer clear of these vices because the king is, after all, the deputy and the vice-regent of God himself. So these meannesses are: first, falsehood. The first mean quality which can in no way be associated with the dignity of kingship. Hakims have opined that a person lies either on account of meanness, which is not characteristic to be proud of, or from necessity, want, or frustration. But for a king who is successful and an honorable office bearer, there can possibly be no reason to lie. One vital advantage of both kingship for the king and the subjects is that everything is done before the king, righteously. And since the king is an embodiment of authority, no one will dare to lie before him. But if the king himself takes to falsehood, the advantage is turned to a misfortune, both for him and his subjects. The second meanness is changeability. Changeability implies turning aside from one's actions or words. That means a king must always take care to live true to his words. If a king fails to live up to his words or promises, his people will no longer repose their trust or faith in him, and in such cases, kingship becomes vain and futile. The third meanness which must never inhere in a noble or virtuous king is perfidy or deception. Perfidy verges on godlessness and pride, while deception stems from hypocrisy and falsehood. There should always be consistency in the king's actions and standards, and any kind of perfidy, deception, hypocrisy, trickery, or fraud is completely unworthy of the nobility that underlines the institution of kingship. A fourth meanness which does not go well with kingship is wrathfulness. This is not identical to anger, for it is natural for human beings to be angry once in a while. But what Barani means by wrathfulness is being overwhelmed by anger. Barani even talks about a man who becomes a victim of his own wrath. Wrathfulness prevents a king from easing his anger by laughing, eating, and enjoying. The dignity, nobility, and virtues underlying kingship consist mostly in showing affection, mercy, grace, kindness, and forgiveness, and these are certainly not compatible with wrathfulness. And finally, the meanness of promoting unjust and nurturing cruelty. These are also domains from which a king must steer clear, because this basically amounts to giving in to unfairness and injustice. If the virtue of justice exists, the nurture and promotion of injustice is impossible. Whenever an unjust man is favored, the promotion of injustice is a natural and invariable consequence. So every king must take utmost caution to guard against any form of injustice or undue cruelty without any justification. Importance of the personality of the king is also stressed by Barani, because people were influenced by the character and actions of the monarch, and so it was necessary for him to maintain all the legal virtues associated with kingship. For him, the king is very important. He is the linchpin of the sultanate. The king's dominance over all the affairs of the state is ensured by suggesting various methods According to Barani, the king should objectively implement the Shariat in all walks of life objectively. Both Balban and Alauddin brought legitimacy and stability to the institution of kingship. Alauddin also, like Balban, was a shrewd judge of public opinion and generally succeeded in ensuring the loyalty of his subjects by pronouncing laws that would meet with popular approval. But he would invoke stern measures against those who dared to defy public order because his main concern was to maintain peace and stability for the welfare of the people. We therefore find the ideal of kingship in the Delhi Sultanate was largely influenced by Islamic ideas whereby the rulers claimed to be representatives of God on earth, and they definitely ruled by divine right. In order to reinforce the legitimacy of kingship, some like Iltutmish, Muhammad bin Tughlaq, and Firoz Shah Tughlaq even got a letter from the Caliph at Baghdad, Iltutmish declaring himself as the helper of the Caliph. So the king rules by divine right as God's agent on earth, an idea flagged by sultans of the Sultanate successively. The same idea was followed by Alauddin Khilji, who followed the footsteps of Balban, and he assumed the title of Sikandar-e-Sani, or the Second Alexander, and being a keen judge of the reality of politics, with characteristic shrewdness, kept away the ulema from his decision-making periphery. But subsequently we find Ghiyasuddin being soft on the ulema and extremely social with his nobles. The trend of appeasement with the ulema was intensified by Firoz Shah, who became subservient to the ulema, and as a result, the monarch's position was somewhat weakened. Only two pressure groups thereafter existed who had varying impacts on the king at various times. They were the nobility and the ulema. And since the basic law was the Shariat, the ulema or the interpreters of law would necessarily constitute the largest single body of those who were in a position to impose limitations on the power of the king. Public conformity to the Shariat was required on part of the king, and so you can understand the ulema as a locus of power could definitely mobilize power against the king. And we see Barani draws attention to the fact that the king was often torn between the requirements of Islam and those of kingship. A king is expected to be a devout follower of Islam, but the virtues inculcated by Islam are directly opposed to the qualities which a king must possess if he is to perform his functions properly. The necessary virtues of devotion are supplication, helplessness, poverty, and humility. But the qualities of kingship are often opposed to, and in fact, the very reverse of these, like terror, prestige, pride, high status, domination, and superiority, which are actually attributes that befit God alone, and yet they are also necessary qualities of kingship. So what is the king's dilemma? Barani admits that there can be no greater difficulty for a human being than to emulate the attributes of God while keeping aside all human qualities in order to carry out the affairs of the government and the administration. But if in this context, when the king tries to approximate the attributes of God and in so doing deprives himself of all human virtues and qualities, deep down in his heart, he may still feel the softening dictates of supplication and humility. So Barani has an answer. Supplication cannot be combined with kingship. Nevertheless, if through divine favor the desire for God so overpowers the heart of the king, and supplication fills his breast in such a way that he is not free from this supplication for a single moment, then this is a sure sign of his promotion to high stations in the next world where he will attain salvation. So let us, friends, come to some of the major concluding observations that I have already highlighted. The supremacy of the Sultan and the security of his Sultanate could not have been ensured without delivering justice to the subjects. Barani informs that the Sultans were always conscious about implementing rules which complemented public opinion in one way or the other. The Sultan was also careful to prevent rebellions against him. And the real justification for the supremacy of the kings and of their power and dignity, Barani had remarked, is the need for enforcing justice. However, while delivering justice, the king should know the appropriate occasions for both forgiveness and punishment. Barani clarified that kingship was primarily a matter of force. This idea was not altogether alien to the Indian civilization, where the king, since ancient times, was considered a repository of the power of danda, or the right to coerce or punish. But it has to be borne in mind, and this I have repeated earlier, is that Barani's idea of force was based on the army and rooted in military tactics rather than merely in the king's right to inflict punishment. And finally, the sultans or kings of the Delhi Sultanate were looked upon as the right hand of God's caliph. They were, for all practical purposes, the arbitrators of justice and punishment, nothing short of God's shadow on earth, and ruling by divine right with a clear focus on the maintenance of peace and stability in the kingdom and catering to the political welfare of the subjects. This idea of Islamic power and authority was given currency to and sustained by prominent writings between the 5th and the 11th centuries, and they contributed in projecting what I have said earlier. The Delhi Sultanate was not an expediency, but as an ideal of Islamic power manifested, embodied, and personified in the figure of the Sultan.